Good morning if you are in Western Australia, and good afternoon if you are anywhere else in Australia. We're going to kick off this webinar now. So hopefully you've got your coffee in hand and we're going to chat about how to host a Zoom webinar. I'm Nicky Jurd and I'm here today to tell you everything you need to know about hosting a Zoom webinar. We have some time for Q&A today at the end, but I would love it if you would jump in at any time and ask questions. If you have a look down the bottom, you'll notice that things are a bit different to your average Zoom meeting. You see, there's only a couple of controls for you to use today, and how you can ask me a question is number one, you can click on the chat and type the question to me. This works pretty similar to other chats you would have used in Zoom before. And there's just a few restrictions there. You'll see that you only have the option to talk to me as a panelist or to talk to everybody as the panelists and the attendees. So that's the first big difference between Zoom webinars and Zoom meetings. But please, at any time, jump on in and type a chat to me and I'll have a go at answering it on the spot as we go. The second option is down the bottom, there's a Q&A button. This is a little more formal in the way of asking a question and something you wouldn't have seen before in the meeting space. And that is to just type a question, and it has this formal tracking system. So I can say if I've answered it live or if I'm going to defer it later, and you get some notifications if your question's been answered. So please feel free to interact. Jump on in right now and send me a message so you know how it works. So click on chat and send me a message. Go on, be brave. Woohoo, I'm getting some messages now. I can tell, Loney, you are not going mad. No, you cannot find the mute. And the reason is because you can't talk right now, but I'll come back to that in a second. Hello and good afternoon, everybody. I think the chat is working well for you. So let's go on. First of all, I want to introduce you to what we're going to cover today. I'm going to share my screen with you. And let me tell you, when you share your screen on Zoom, things are a little bit tricky. You see, what I've already done is I've opened up PowerPoint on my second monitor over here that you can't see, and I've started the slideshow. And if anyone's ever done that before, you'll know that your PowerPoint totally takes over everything and you lose your Zoom controls. So I am going to use judiciously my Alt-Tab today. If you don't know what Alt-Tab is, that's a PC way of swapping between programs. And that way I can get back to Zoom when I've got my PowerPoint taking over. So there's tip number one for you. When you share your PowerPoint, it's going to totally overwhelm you, but you just need to use Alt-Tab to swap back to Zoom. So here we go. That's the start screen that I showed you when you all came in. I had that loaded up so you had something to look at when you arrived. And I think this is a really good way of kicking off a webinar, is people know as soon as they've arrived that you as a host are organized and you have all of your stuff together. Here's what we're going to cover today. We're going to cover the major differences between meetings and webinars. And that's because most people haven't used the webinar platform before. They've only used the meeting platform inside Zoom. There are definitely lots of similarities, but there are also some differences as well. Then I'm going to talk you through some of the exclusive features inside webinars, and we're going to test some out together. And then finally, so you don't completely send your audience to sleep, I'm sure lots of us have been on a Zoom session over the last 4 weeks where that's happened. You've gone and checked your emails and maybe taken a phone call or done all sorts of stuff online because the webinar is just not that engaging. Hopefully we're going to change that and we're going to be engaging together. So first up, let's talk about the difference between meetings versus webinars. I'm going to stop my share now because as part of being engaging, I think it's a really good idea that you try not to use PowerPoint very much. And the reason is it just takes over and takes up full screen. More on that later. Mostly you're going to be seeing me today. So the differences between meetings and webinars, let's talk that through. Number one, you'll see that we have no other video today. You can only see me. And that's because a webinar is more designed to be like a lecturer standing in a big auditorium and speaking out to a large audience. If you've ever been on a platform before where you've been on stage, on theatre, and you've got lights on you and you can't see your audience at all, that's the closest you will get to being on a webinar. Now, I've had a message come through from Lynn that she's having some trouble hearing. Do you mind giving me a bit of a shout out down below if you can hear? Okay, so other people have got other people are okay. Lynn, it's probably just on your end, probably the sound. Maybe try changing your speakers, I'm thinking. That's probably the only option. Thank you everyone for that response. I'm trying out these new bone conducting headsets and the response from them so far has been amazing. So that's really what webinars are designed for, is to be one, me, to many, all of you. And you can have multiple people on video. On a webinar, they're referred to as a panelist. And so if we had other people here today joining in with me, you would be able to see their videos as well. The second thing you'll notice is that as an attendee today, there are no controls for you to be able to play with in terms of muting your microphone or changing your video or any of those kinds of things that you typically see in a meeting. And that's because webinars are designed not to be so interactive. They're much more controlled. And I find that the webinar platform for most people who are used to meetings now is perhaps a little frustrating because they're used to that interaction. And I know for me as a host, it is much more fun to see all of your faces on screen than to see just me or just my shared screen. So if you're deciding between should I deliver as a webinar or should I deliver as a meeting, what you should think about is how much interaction you want with your audience. You will see also in the chat, usually you are able to interact with other attendees through the chat, being able to send them a private message and so forth. And here you can't. You can either talk to everybody so everyone sees your message, or you can just talk to the panelists directly. And so today that's only me. So that interaction is definitely dampened down. And that's why I think it works best as the kind of platform that you would be used to in an auditorium kind of setting. I'm going to share something with you in the chat now. Hold tight. And this is a link for you to visit later. Zoom's put together a really good overview on all the features that are in meetings and all of the features that are in webinars side by side so you can see them. In fact, some of them might really surprise you. Like as an example, I didn't realize that you could live stream meetings to Facebook and Facebook's Workplace and YouTube. I thought that was only a feature for webinars, but in fact, that's something that both of those options are enabled. One of the other big differences is you can use the webinar platform as a bit more like a formal event, so an event that someone would pay to attend. And how that works is you can enable registrations and then link your Zoom account to your PayPal account, and then you can charge people to attend your webinar. So I think that's a pretty cool feature that I actually don't see too many paid webinars at the moment. Most of them are free or very, very low cost. But if you would like to have a crack at running a paid webinar, then definitely making that connection would be the way to go. So when you have a spare moment, have a look through that list. It's a really good, tight little list that puts the two side by side. The reason most people have never used the webinar platform before is because you have to pay for it. And you have to pay sort of twice. Lots of people just have the meeting platform, which is free when you sign up for Zoom. So most people I know are able to use Zoom for up to 3 people in a meeting at no charge. And after 3 people, you have a 40-minute time slot. So that's what you do on the free account. If you pay for a pro account, that time restriction is removed. But you can still only have 100 people in a meeting. Let me tell you, 100 people in a meeting is kind of hard to manage. On the weekend, I managed one that had 450 people in it, and everyone was live on video, and there was a lot of interaction. And so, yeah, as you increase the numbers of a meeting, it definitely becomes more challenging. When you have a paid account, with Zoom, you can then purchase that add-on, the webinar add-on. And this allows you to run a webinar like today for up to 100 attendees. So it's still quite a generous number of people who can come along. And that add-on is, I think, $59 Australian on top of a pro account, which is the smallest paid account you can buy, which is $20.99. So really, we see the webinar platform being used by people who are serious speakers or do large scale events already and have, I guess, their own tribe in the offline world. And then they're adapting that offline space to the online for right now. So let me just jump on in here and summarize what we've seen. And I'm happy for anybody to ask a question at this point about the difference between meetings and webinars. You're probably getting used to it right now anyway. So please jump on in the chat and let me know if you have any questions so far. So here's what the major differences between the two is meetings are so much more interactive and webinars are so much more controlled. I've got a question here from Michelin, is I can't see you. She's asking, can you see us? And absolutely not. No, the only video available in a webinar is that of the panelists and the host. And so that's all you can see. Whereas in meetings, you can see everyone's. Now, in the meetings account, you can have a free account to start off with, or you can pay to remove that time limit for meetings of more than 3 people. And webinars, you must first have a paid account in order to then upgrade to the webinar extension or the webinar add-on, as they call it. And then you have the ability to do this. Now, you can have up to 10,000 people on a webinar if you pay more and more and more. So they are able to run really large scale events. And I think that's very exciting from the online space. One of the frustrations I think I have with the webinars is just that lack of interaction. It's I'm just so used to seeing people look away or smiling or having a bit of a laugh or being able to unmute them quite freely so that they can be more participative in my meetings. So I do find the webinar platform comparatively quite frustrating. So if you're thinking of running an event that is probably more than 50 people, I would say the webinar is the place for that because it's hard to manage large scale interaction. But if you like a bit of a chat and you love that interaction, like Loni has just put through the chat, then the meeting platform is probably the right one for you. All right, no more questions on this. Let's move on to the new section now, which is the exclusive features of the meeting platform. Some of these I've already talked about, but I'll just rehash them so that they're really clear. Is number one, there are no participant videos. So I can't see you and you can't see each other. So that's the exclusive space for the webinars, is the only video is me as the panelist. The second is that the chat is heavily restricted. And this can be a good thing when you want people to absolutely pay attention to your content and you want them to be totally present. But I also think that this is one of the fun things in Zoom, is being able to have that interactive chat that we see in meetings. So restricted chat is great for when you want to really control how your attendees interact with each other. The next exclusive feature is that PayPal can be integrated with registrations for webinars so that you can charge attendance, and that happens automatically through the Zoom space. I do find where you integrate Zoom and another external event registration process, like say Eventbrite, which is how you've registered for today. When you do it that way, you add this extra layer of complexity for you to have to follow and make sure that everything works out right. I do prefer to use the Zoom registration as much as possible, and it is fairly good in the webinar space because when you use that registration, you have some exclusivity over how the emails work. So I will demonstrate that in a second because we'll jump in and we'll set one up together. But you get a lot more control over how the registrations work. a big exclusive feature that is not available at all in the meetings platform is the Q&A that you see down the bottom. And so that formal Q&A process so that someone can ask a question, and when you've answered it, it automatically gets moved to the answers section. That's probably the best feature that I see in webinars, and I do kind of wish that that was available in meetings. I would love you to test it out right now. So if you jump down to the Q&A, type a question. It doesn't have to be a real question. I just want to show you how it works. And I'm looking at you, Agatha. I know you promised to ask questions today, so please jump on down to the Q&A button down the bottom and ask me a question. There we go. Teresa's just asked me, how are you? So as the host, I have the option to either answer live or type the answer. So I'm going to answer live and tell Teresa that I am fantastic today. Thank you so much for asking. I would be better with a cup of coffee. And now that I've said I've answered this question, it goes up into the answered tab at the top, and Teresa gets a notification to say, hey, Nikki's answered your question, in case she was, over there, perhaps making a coffee or answering her email. Tony's asked me where am I based, so I'm going to send a typed reply this time so we can see that one. So I've replied, I'm in Cairns, and the weather today, Catherine, is pretty ordinary. It's raining for the first time in a while. Bruce has asked, will the comparison document be sent out afterwards? And absolutely yes, I can send it over to Agatha, and she will distribute that afterwards. Michelin says my makeup is fantastic. I need someone like you in my pocket for when I'm having a bad day. And what I'm going to do with your question, Michelin, is I'm actually going to just dismiss it. And so it goes in a different tab up the top. For me, I can see that it's dismissed. And Agatha says, yes, she has questions. Have I had any coffee this morning? And the answer is yes, I am well caffeinated. Thank you for asking. And so that's how the Q&A works. Now, to answer those questions just then, I had the Q&A tab open really big, and I have it just directly below my camera. And the reason I do that is because I'm going to be staring at the screen for a bit, and all you can see is me on video. I don't really want to lose that engagement with you. And we know that in the professional speaking world, eye contact is everything. So when you connect with your eyes with your audience, that's when they pay attention, they keep looking at you. And that's what I'm trying to do today by looking at my camera and to keep you engaged. And so if I ever have to pull something up and read it, I try to put it up here rather than on my second screen over here, because as you can see, when I look at my second screen, I totally lose you all. So that's how I manage the Q&A part of a webinar. I will say it is a definite challenge to read questions and answer them and not be awkward throughout that. And I think it's a skill you should absolutely practice. So perhaps try sending a text message to mum while you're having a chat with your kids over dinner. I think that's the easiest way to learn this whole multitasking space. Now, Agatha has asked me a question that I think might be a real question, and that is, should I record my webinar locally or to the cloud? Which is a real can of worms kind of a question, but let me explain. If you want to make sure that you do not forget to press the record button, you should always record to the cloud. There's a spot where you can just tick where you set up the webinar. I'll show you that in a second, and then it will automatically record the moment you start. That is, of course, fraught with some issues as well, because if you start with a video and maybe you pick your nose before you start, you get ready, have a bit of a drink, that's all in the video at the beginning as well. And so before emailing it to your attendees, you'll want to trim that unnecessary stuff off the beginning of the video. But the good thing is you will never forget, because it just happens automatically. If you select to record your webinar to your computer, you will 90% of the time forget to press record. And I've seen this time and time again in webinars and meetings that I attend, that someone will be halfway through and, oh no, I forgot to press the record button. And so I usually recommend to everyone to have a run sheet. And part of that run sheet is a housekeeping section that says, oh, and everyone, we're going to be recording this webinar today. So if you have any issues with that, just turn off your video and you won't be included in the recording. or something of that nature. And so for that reason, I recommend to record in the cloud. Another reason why you might want to choose to do it locally instead of to the cloud is that the quality of the final video is dramatically higher. And there are some video settings that you can set up inside your video settings panel in Zoom to increase the quality of that recording. But that's another reason why you might choose on your computer. So if you know that you're forgetful and you don't have a housekeeping section, then I would record to the cloud always. And if you want a really high quality video, because maybe you're going to turn into an online course or something like that, then I would record locally. So they're the two options. Tony has asked me where I get my headphones from. They're from a company called Aftershocks. You can only buy them online. I'll put a link in the chat towards the end for you, Loney. All right, so I've answered both of those questions live, so they now go into the answered section of my Q&A. Now, the other part of the exclusive webinar space that is fantastic is how it manages email reminders. You have quite a lot of different reminders that you can set up, and you have control over what they say. So this is something that the meeting platform is really restrictive on. And so if you have the email reminders set up, you must have registration set up first, and then you get quite a few different email reminders. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump on in to share my screen with you so you can see the process of scheduling a webinar. Most people will never have seen this before because they have to pay to get this turned on. So hold tight, and thank you to Business Station because this is their account. And as you can see, they have quite a lot of upcoming webinars. So if you would like to book into any of these coming up into the future, there is lots of things about to happen. When you first arrive in Zoom, you usually arrive in the Meetings tab. That's the default space, like the dashboard. Here we're clicking on the webinars on the left-hand side. And then we're going to click Schedule a Webinar. If you have scheduled a meeting before, you'll be fairly familiar with this screen. It's very, very similar to what you would usually see. And so let's have a little look here. So first of all, the topic, and this is the topic that the public will see. So you want to make it publicly accessible, if you know what I mean. Sometimes if you have internal notification like we do inside our company, we'll have use our initials for who's going to be hosting meetings and so forth. We would not use that internal notification here. This would be Nicky's awesome webinar on coffee brewing. I really love coffee. So maybe one day you'll get to come to my coffee brewing webinar. This part, the webinar description, why it says optional is that's because nobody sees it. Only you will see it if you go into the webinar settings here. And so it's really good if you have multiple people in your company who access your account so that you can give them a bit of information about what is going to be covered in that webinar. This bit is so important and so many people get it accidentally wrong. I would recommend you go through it really carefully, and that is the scheduling part. So what day it's going to be on, and annoyingly, it's in US date format. So I always click the calendar icon and select it from here because otherwise I get confused with the month being at the beginning. What time it is, the duration. Now, I don't want you to worry too much about the duration. And why I say that is because when you say it's 1 hour, people worry, oh no, is it going to just automatically stop after 1 hour? And it absolutely isn't. It will just keep going up to 24 hours. And yeah, so if you say 1 hour, that's just how long it's going to tell people in the notification it's going to last, but it will go on after that. The time zone is the default time zone that you have for your Zoom account. So in this case, it's Business Station's account. They're based in Perth, and so it's using the Western Australian time zone there. If you're going to do this often, you can click recurring, and then it happens at that same time in whatever kind of recurrence you would like. Now, this is the registration trigger that I mentioned before, then gives you the email reminder setting and also enables you to connect that to PayPal if you would like. to password or not to password, that's up to you. For now, I'm going to turn it off. Here you can select whether or not your panelists and your hosts will have video. So that will depend a little bit on the style of your webinar and what you're going to be doing. I strongly recommend, as much as possible, you should turn that video feature on. It really is a much better way to interact with people on screen. For the audio, Zoom has this really cool feature that allows people to call and listen to the audio if they don't have a computer. And this is really useful with Zooms where you have, I guess, older folk or technically challenged folk, because they mostly already know how to use their phone. And so this part dial from Australia means that Zoom is going to give an Australian phone number for those people to Zoom in. Now, of course, they can't see anything. This is just for the audio. So it's just like a telephone call. And now the options of what you would like to do inside your webinar. Should you enable Q&A? Yes or no? If you turn it off, the chat function will still be available. So this is for the formal Q&A, which is that button down below that I showed you before how to use. You can have a practice session, but the practice session affects the recording. I'll show you that in a second. Authenticated users means that only people with a Zoom account is able to join this. And that's a security feature to try and prevent Zoom bombing or all sorts of issues that you might have along the way. You've maybe read a bit about the security that Zoom has been updating since the FBI came out and said, oh no, online meetings are so unsafe. So that's why this feature is there. It's just an extra layer of security where you can say only people who have signed up for Zoom can actually join this webinar. You can make it on demand, so people can just connect at any old time. And this is the section that I answered before of Agata's question is, do we record this webinar automatically? And is it automatically on the local computer or in the cloud? So that's where your options are. Now, if I go back and enable the practice session, it usually pops up with a little message around recording, and it is, there we go. So see how for recording to have a practice session, you need a certain version of your Zoom app, and the practice session actually is inside the cloud recording. And so you'll have to edit out that practice session if you don't want it to be in the recording. And so that's it. Then we press schedule. Once you've scheduled the webinar, now Agata, when you jump into your account later this afternoon, you'll see this Nikki's awesome webinar on coffee brewing. Don't take it seriously though, we're not going to do it. Once you've saved, you get this big section down the bottom with lots of extra tools for you to play with. Some of the more useful ones, I won't go through them all right now because we don't have quite enough time, but some of the more useful ones is around the registration questions. So if you have a look, I might just jump into the email sections first. Hold on a sec. So email settings, see all the different kinds of reminders that you can have in there. It's really quite granular how many different things that you can send to people. You can change the branding on your registration page, and there's lots and lots of options here as well. We haven't talked about polls at all. Polls work the same in meetings as they do in webinars. I will test a poll a little bit later if anybody would like me to. It's a little tricky to do on the fly. So what I mean by on the fly is during the webinar. It's much easier to set up a poll question in advance. On the weekend, I helped somebody run an AGM for an organization, and they have elections and they have motions that needed to be passed and seconded, and they used this poll feature quite successfully. But of course, their meeting agenda was already preset and is quite rigid. So it was quite easy to set up all those poll questions in advance. Q&A, there's some extra things that you can do. So you can stop people from being able to have an anonymous question, for example. This is where you integrate with other places. And so like PayPal, for example, and then live streaming into one of these other spaces. I have seen a lot of Zoom meetings running on Facebook Live as well, which I think is really exciting. The only drawback is when you're normally on a Zoom meeting, you're on your PC and it's quite big. Whereas when people are on Facebook, they tend to be on their phone or sometimes their tablet, but usually their phone, and the screen is a lot smaller. So if you do the live stream integration, you should absolutely think about how you use PowerPoint, especially if your slides tend to have a lot of words on them, because once they fit into a tiny, tiny little screen on a phone, it will be much harder for people to see. Usually when I'm creating PowerPoint slides, I try to keep them not very wordy anyway. My rule of thumb is what I can fit on a Post-it note is what I will put on a PowerPoint slide, and that's how I save you all for death by PowerPoint. Now back to the registrations part. So all of this stuff is related to registrations. Down here, you can choose to manually approve registrations. So registration here is ticked required because that was the setting I put up earlier. I can automatically approve them. So as soon as someone registers, they're approved, or I can manually approve them. And the manually approve option is very good for if you're running an AGM and you need someone who is in attendance that you know actually has a vote. So they're a member, for example. And then as a registration comes in, you can check your membership list and approve them manually. When you register, each person gets their own unique URL to attend the webinar in the same way that meetings do. And that's how you try to control who can attend. Now you can ask loads of questions. Automatically, there's a few questions that Zoom automatically asks, which is first name, surname, and email address. In addition to that, you can ask all of these automatically just by ticking them, or you can add custom questions. So the question might be, how do you like your coffee? And somebody then has to answer that question when they register because I've said it's required. So then save all, and that gets added to the registration space. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an overview on the most boring part of this webinar, and that is how to set it up. And the main reason I wanted to do this today is because most of us have never seen that setup process because you have to pay for it as an extension. So right now is a great time to jump on in and ask me a question. Does anyone have any questions on this bit? Oh no, I must have answered them all. I'm seeing crickets. So here's the overview on the exclusive features of Zoom webinars. Number one, there are no participant videos. Massive pain. Number two, well, okay, massive pain if you're like me and you like to see your audience. Number two, the chat is heavily restricted. You can integrate with PayPal so that you can take payments. Everyone is automatically muted, so you never have to worry about someone's microphone having a dog barking in the background or kids running on into the room. You won't hear any of that. You're much more focused as a presenter as a result. You have an interactive and really formal Q&A process, and you have a big section of email reminders if you would like to turn on registrations. Agatha's asked a question in my Q&A, and that is the security important to put a password on the webinar? I think it is as important as it is in the meeting space. So if you are going to be broadcasting this webinar URL to everyone, so let's say that you don't have registrations and you're going to put it on your Facebook page, hey everyone, I'm going to be doing a webinar today at 1 o'clock, jump on, then yes, I think the password's important for anything that's public, and I would distribute the password separately to that public event. So I think it's important. I will say that I haven't seen any of the issues that some people have reported. I don't think they're widespread. And so those kinds of issues are that people have shared pornography through a meeting, people have uploaded files that have some kind of malware or some security issues. I've easily done 50 hours of Zoom a week since we've gone into COVID. And the worst thing I've seen is 2 people in a single week that had someone naked walk behind them. And that was just an accident. In both cases, it was that that people who lived with them did not realize that they were on video. So that's really the worst thing I've seen. So I like to be a little bit careful though, and I use the password, and I also like to make the password really quirky. I don't use the standard 2677 that Zoom tries to put in by default. I make it interesting and memorable, and that means that people won't have trouble finding it to join. So thanks so much for your question, Agatha. All right, now if that's the end of the questions about the exclusive features, I'm going to move on now to this part, which is about being engaging. And I want to show you a screenshot that I took in a webinar this morning. And so this is a really good friend of mine. His name is Andrew Griffiths, and he is an absolutely sensational presenter. I've seen him live on stage maybe 20 times. He is really engaging and fantastic. But in his online webinars, it was not nearly as engaging. His voice was great to listen to. His energy was fantastic, but his entire time was filled with these slightly cheesy PowerPoint slides. And some of them, like this one, had quite a lot of text. And let me tell you the two issues with this. Is number one is people will engage with you much more than they will ever engage with slides. I think that when you use slides inside a webinar, you're really giving people death by PowerPoint on a major scale, which is what I'm doing to you right now, and I'm going to stop in a second. But I thought it was important to see a comparison of what a not engaging webinar looks like from a very engaging presenter. And as you can see, I am in this tiny little box that is on the side, and that's the same for this presenter as well. So you can only see them really squidgy in that tiny little box, and that box is probably covering some of the text as well. So there's a few things to think about when you do PowerPoint. Now, I took a screenshot of one of my earlier webinars. That's what I look like on video on a different day when I'm happy and smiling. And I thought it was important to show you the difference between death by PowerPoint and video. This is me today. So we're back live. I think a lot of webinars are not very engaging. Mostly people are not very comfortable with the controls, and they don't invite their attendees to chat with them often. They don't invite questions. They usually have a Q&A that's stuck right at the end. And especially like today when we have a quasi-technical topic, I think it's important to allow you to jump in at any time so you don't forget the question and I don't have to relearn the context of what the question is. I think also that getting people to talk to you as much as possible helps you as a presenter when you can't see them as well. So being engaging, number one is to know your controls and direct people to how to use them. So you'll see I'll often point down the bottom to say, click on the chat button down the bottom, or if I'm in a meeting, I'll say, go ahead and unmute yourself over on the left-hand side there. Just click the microphone button. Now, none of you can see that right now because we're not in a meeting, but I use those controls quite a lot to encourage people to interact with me. And today, I think the Q&A is an extra one as well that I would encourage. You'll notice you also have a button down there to raise your hand. Very formal, like in school. Okay, everyone, raise your hand or not. I've seen that used quite successfully in a really large-scale meeting, and I see Agatha has raised her hand already. Oh my God, there's lots of people raising their hands right now. That's fantastic. One of the benefits of this is it jumps up to the top of your screen and it shows that their hand is up, and I can allow people to talk. So I'm not sure if Agatha has her microphone plugged in today. I hope you do, Agatha, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to allow you to talk for just a second so that I can show people how that works. So hold tight. We're going to hear from Agatha, hopefully. I didn't prime it for this, so let's see. Agatha, are you there?
Hey, hello. Sure.
Hello.
Thanks. You did give me a heads up on this.
No, I didn't. Thank you so much for jumping on in. And so everyone can see now how we get a second option. So you can see the panel is split into two. Agatha's on one side and I'm on the other. And I can just go ahead and mute her. So Agatha, I'm going to mute you again. I hope that's okay.
That's all right. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so I'm going to disable her talking, and so her screen completely disappears from view. And I think that's a really good way of interacting with people in quite a controlled way. Let's say they ask you a question in the chat and you don't really understand what it is, then I would encourage you to get them to raise their hand, because then they jump up very publicly in view and you can unmute them that way. And I think that's quite a nice way of interacting with folk. Now, once you've dealt with that, it's important to then lower their hand. And so I've just used the tool to lower Agatha's hand. And so now I don't have any hands up. And if you would like to ask a question with your audio, please go ahead and raise your hand and we will use that tool as well. So how you can be engaging, use chat, use Q&A, and use the raise hand feature to hear from people. I think lots of reasons why people are not very engaging on webinars is because they're not very familiar with the tech tools. And what I mean by that is if they try to say start a poll, or if they try to share their screen, you get this awkward fumbling silence, or perhaps people over apologize. And I would encourage you as a webinar presenter to take on the persona that the show must go on, and to hide any issues that you're having behind the scenes. Try to make it as smooth as possible for your audience. And I think this about live events as well. If something goes wrong, have a bit of a joke about it. But if it's just a small little hiccup, like you can't quite find your screen share in the nanosecond that you've tried, I would try to be really silent about that and just be quiet instead of apologizing. It gives a much better performance to people who are in attendance. Now, remember your eye contact, and that is look at the camera as much as you can, or look at yourself on screen, which is really confronting. It's like presenting into a mirror so that people think that you're looking at them. It's the same if you watch television presenters. Where they look off camera, you'll notice that they're not nearly as interesting or engaging, especially if they're doing something like delivering the news. How you can give the impression of better eye contact is to move back a bit from your computer. So in my case, my laptop is a bit more than arm's length away. I've got it up high on some books so that my eye level is actually at the camera level. And I've moved it further away so that if I'm looking directly at you, I don't need to actually stare into the lens of the camera. I can look slightly down. You would probably know from the many Zooms that you've been on that most of the cameras are looking up people's noses or awkwardly on a second screen, and it's not very good. The best placement is front and center, raised up eye level, and hopefully with some good lighting around you. So today I've got some really good natural light going on. So I've got a window in front of me that you can't see and a window beside me, and the natural light in this room is actually pretty good. But just in case something happens, like it starts to rain, I've got this extra light that you can change the color and the brightness of, and it gives me just a bit more of a glow. So during the day, I usually use the blue setting because it's the closest to natural light, and I turn it down quite a bit. So you can see the difference there between the light and no light. I think this is really important if you don't have a good room to be in. Lots of people have a room where it's bright behind them, and even with curtains down, you can still see the intensity of the light coming through. The light on your face makes a really big difference to how you present and engage. If you can, I would use an external webcam. So you can use the webcam that's built into your laptop if you already have one. If you are like me and had a webcam in a cupboard that you weren't really using, now is the time to dig it out because you get a much better picture. I'm going to demonstrate this. Hold tight. I'm going to swap between my cameras. And so this is the camera that's built into my laptop. It's much lower quality. You can see I'm a little bit fuzzy and a little bit red. And the webcam camera, which I'll swap back to now, is much brighter. It takes light better. It's higher quality. And you would have seen how I've just jumped between those cameras. This can be really effective if you're demonstrating something in a webinar. I've seen it where the presenter is talking and then she's going to cook something. And so she has a webcam up on a tripod pointing down at her hands. And then she jumps to that and keeps talking over the top. And it's really seamless and quite easy just to change between those cameras. So if you would like to try demonstrating something, the two cameras work really, really well. In my case, Teresa, I've got a question in Q&A. What webcam do I use? And it's a Logi, so a Logitech, and it's a 1080p. Now, I know because I've been trying to get another one for one of my staff, is these are absolutely impossible to get anywhere in Australia right now. So you may have to import one from Amazon US if you would like it. It'll still only take a week to arrive, but webcams are as rare as hen's teeth out there right now. I would also recommend, to be engaging, that you think about your energy, because webinars are typically really flat, and people, when they're sitting down, their voice tends to be more monotone than if they were standing on stage and being their natural stage present self. And so what I mean by manage your energy is to think about when there's something exciting to talk about, to raise your voice, to get excited, to make it a bit faster, use some gestures, and try to think about where your video is and where your hands are. So I know in my case, you can just see from there up. And so I would not usually be gesturing here right next to my shoulders. I would be gesturing down in my lap. And so it's definitely a different presenting style to be able to bring your hands up a bit higher and to show that interaction. And finally, I think it's important to have a run sheet. And Agatha actually has a fantastic run sheet that I'll share with you in the chat. Actually, no, I can't share with you in the chat because we can't do file transfers in a webinar. We will send it out afterwards. And what it does is it just goes through an example of somebody's webinar or meeting top to bottom. So what's going to happen at 3 minutes? When's this slide going to come on? And that's especially useful if you have multiple panelists or multiple presenters, so that everyone has a really good idea of what's going to happen. So there's two things we're going to send out with you today. Number one is the comparison between Zoom meetings and Zoom webinars. And number two is the run sheet from that other presenter, which we have permission to share with you. So yeah, there are some really good resources. Now, hold tight. I'm going to jump on in to our slideshow again. And I'm going to just show you the conclusion here of what we just covered about being engaging. Is knowing your controls is really important, because you don't want that awkward interaction as you shift between things. And I would say, if I'm looking at this recording back and giving myself a bit of an evaluation, that I would say the way I just transitioned to PowerPoint there was too awkward for my liking, and I would be much more smooth next time around. You should test how the screen share works. And this is because this is the primary spot where people get stuck, and it's also where things might let you down. When I share my screen, I only ever share the actual program I'm going to be putting up on screen. I never actually share my screen. So when you click the share screen button, you get a whole bunch of options on a pop-up from Zoom. And the first two options are the monitors that you have. So in my case, I'm running 2 monitors. So it says screen 1 or screen 2. And the only reason I would ever use that kind of screen share is when I'm going to be jumping through different programs to demonstrate them. Otherwise, I would always click on one of the individual programs that I have open. Like right now, I'm only sharing with you the slideshow part of PowerPoint, not PowerPoint itself. And I think it's just a bit safer, because most of us have stuff on our computer that's a bit personal and isn't that appropriate in a professional setting. Or perhaps you're like me and your computer pops up with emails you've received and a little snippet of them. Or in our case, we use Slack inside our company for internal messaging. And again, I get a notification with a little snippet of what's come up. And because these are controlled from other people, I don't know necessarily that they're appropriate. And so they will pop up if you share your screen, which I don't really like people to see. So I think you should test your screen share and get into the habit of sharing just the application, just the program you want to show people, not your entire screen. You should try recruiting a panelist, a fellow co-panelist. And that's because if you have a look at the chat right now, when I mentioned that run sheet, Agatha's gone and found that in her SharePoint and she's popped it up as a link inside the chat. And so she's acting as a co-panelist right now, and that's very, very useful. It allows you to concentrate on being an engaging presenter and leaving that kind of nuts and bolts stuff to somebody else, and is also really important if you're going to have a lot of people on and you're expecting a lot of questions, because they can help you manage those questions. Remember eye contact. Try looking at the camera as much as you can, and use a webcam. If you've got one in the cupboard, go dust it off, or look at buying one once we come out of ISO and they're back on the shelves again. Use the chat because people like to interact, and that's one of the only ways that they have. Vary your energy, your voice, the way you present things. Go fast and slow down. Use pausing. That will make it much more interesting. And of course, have a run sheet so that you seem way more organized than you might otherwise be. So, ladies and gentlemen, do we have any questions? Click on the chat right now and let me know. I have a question here from Teresa, is do you need 2 screens? And the answer is no, you definitely don't need 2 screens. But as an IT person, 2 screens is the absolute bare minimum that I can have without my fellow IT professionals making jokes about me. Most of my office use 3 to 5 screens, and that's kind of excessive. I will say that a second screen dramatically improves your productivity. I'm not sure why, but just having things open on the 2, you can jump between things much faster. And I find when I'm presenting a webinar, I open all of the things I want to show you on one screen, and I use Zoom video on the other screen. And I find it's just much faster and smoother for me to manage that way. I have tried delivering presentations over Zoom on my iPad, and because there's only the one screen and it's really difficult and awkward to send a chat message, I don't find it near as fun. So short answer is no, you definitely don't need 2 screens, but I would recommend you give it a try, because as a general business productivity thing, I think it is dramatically better to have 2 screens. Who else agrees with me? Pop in the chat if you have 2 screens and you love it. If I ever have to use my laptop, so maybe if I'm at an airport and I'm getting some work done, I feel like I'm so slow by just having this little one screen in front of me. It's a real pain. Do we have any other questions? Please jump on in. Oh, Bruce has said 2 screens is great. Agatha loves her 2 screens. So yeah, we definitely 2 screens are the way to go. Teresa, screens are really cheap too. So if you, what I usually do is if I'm at home, I go and steal the TV and I use that as my second screen. It's yeah, a good LCD screen can make a great computer screen as well. So yeah, if you're working from home and only have 1 screen, use the TV. It's a really good second screen. Now, Michelin's asked, when I say to click on the app and not the whole screen when screen sharing, they're not really sure what I mean by that. So does this relate to a meeting as well? So let me try to walk you through that. I can't share it and show you, unfortunately, but let me walk you through it. Down the bottom, I have a control that's in bright green that says share screen. And when you host a meeting or a webinar, you get this. It's a big bright button. It's always in the middle. When you click that, you get a pop-up that jumps up over the videos with lots of options of what you can share. The first option is your screen. So in my case, it says screen 1 and then screen 2. Underneath that, I then have all of the programs I have open right now. And so in my case, I've got my PowerPoint slideshow. I've got Google Chrome, which I demonstrated before when we were setting up that webinar. I've got PowerPoint that isn't the slideshow, just the working model of PowerPoint. And then I've also got Windows Explorer open as well. And so I can select any of those to share with you. And so what I'm suggesting is that you don't choose the ones that are at the beginning that says screen 1, or in my case also screen 2. You choose the programs that are open that are underneath. Hopefully that helps you out with that. You can definitely use it in a meeting, and I would practice that. So you can just start a meeting with yourself, schedule a meeting, start it straight away, and then click share, and you can see what I mean. All your programs will come up and open. And the reason why this is important is because when you share your screen, a person can see everything on that screen. So if you minimize something, the the program that you have behind that is then visible. And I can't tell you how many people's emails I've read because they didn't know that they were sharing the wrong screen, or that they closed something and what they've still shared is their email. And that's kind of private, you know. I think most people wouldn't like it if someone was reading their emails. So Teresa says that on her desktop computer, she could definitely use 2 screens. That's yeah, that's the way to go. And yeah, no problem, Michelin. I hope you do have a practice with that. And if you would like, if anybody would like to chat to me over the ASPAS program, I can always experiment with Zoom with you and teach you the controls one-on-one so that you can have a play with it. I have this fantastic client up here in Cairns who is an interior designer, and she's adapted her business so that she doesn't have to go into people's homes right now. She connects with them on Zoom on her laptop, and she gets them to connect on their phone, because the Zoom app is fantastic on a phone and tablet if you're an attendee. And she walks around the house with them. So she says, okay, show me that corner. And she gets them to show her their whole, whatever rooms that she's going to be designing for them. And it's a fantastic way of interacting with people in a way that most people haven't. I will give you a word of warning about that though, is where your attendees are not business people. You know, perhaps you have a shop and you sell gifts that would be perfect for Mother's Day this weekend. Then your customers are probably not as likely to be familiar with Zoom as the people who are here today are. So those of us who are in the corporate world, who do professional services and are used to working from their computer, those kinds of people are much more attuned to how Zoom works because they've probably used it for work once or twice now, whereas the everyday person hasn't. And so when you are engaging with your customers on Zoom, you may need to provide more tech support or more housekeeping at the beginning so that you can get that engagement. Now, Bruce has asked, can you have a webinar with yourself and practice using the functions? You absolutely can, and that's how I learned. So I would set up a webinar with my staff, and I would set up Q&A. So I'd get them to ask a question, then I'd walk on over to their screen and have a look at what they could see. Now, webinar practice is a bit more challenging, Bruce, because you do have to buy the extension before you can practice with it. So paid account first, 20 bucks, and then webinar add-on, which is 60 bucks. So I wouldn't go out and buy it if you're just going to practice with it and maybe think about using it. I think you would only buy it if you were actually going to use it and just wanted to learn it. But yes, you can schedule a test meeting, have people come, or you can just practice all by yourself and not invite anyone at all. I just find it's a little bit better to practice where you can see someone else's screen. So another way I've practiced in the past, especially when I was getting used to sharing slides, is I would connect to my webinar on my iPad, and I would see how long the delay was when I changed the screen. And in the early days, so a couple of years ago when I was first using Zoom, I would always have my iPad connected as an attendee anyway. So that way I could be attuned to what everyone was seeing, and I felt like it was just a little safety net for me to know if something was going wrong on their end. You do have to remember, if you do that though, to turn your speakers down as low as they go, because otherwise you'll get feedback from the 2 microphones picking each other up. So that's how you could practice, is start a webinar for yourself and connect your iPad, or if you've got someone else in your household that has a computer that you can play with right now, I would get them to connect and you move between those two so you can see the functions as a host and also as an attendee. I will say, if you have experience with running Zoom meetings, the webinar is really easy. The only thing that's really challenging is that you can't see people. So it's more like presenting on TV than presenting at an actual meeting. So that's how you could practice if you didn't have the webinar extension, is just schedule a meeting for yourself and play with that, which you can do on the free account straight out of the box. All right, folk, we're getting to the last of our time. So now is your final chance to jump on in with a question. You can do it in the chat, you can do it in the Q&A, or if you're really brave, you can raise your hand and I'll unmute you and we can have a quick chat. Go on, let's see. Ooh, I see crickets and tumbleweed. Well, being no more questions, I'm going to finish off the webinar for today, perfectly on time. How fantastic is that? And hopefully you can go have your lunch break. In 2 weeks, we have another webinar on the tips and tricks for managing webinars in meetings. So some of those interactive elements, we're going to play with them a fair bit. So if you would like to take this a bit further, jump on that. That will be an intermediate kind of level webinar, whereas this is more of a beginning kind of a webinar. So if you would like to learn more, in 2 weeks, we're going to do the tips and tricks on Zoom meetings. Otherwise, I'll see you online. Thanks so much for coming today. Bye.